All right, good morning, freshmen. Happy Monday. Today we are just going to be talking about form. So this whole week is going to be dedicated to form. Today we're going to define form and what it is and what it looks like. And then this week we're just going to be talking about various different kinds of form that are really common in poetry. So form is going to include things like a haiku and a sonnet and different stuff like that that help define specific types of poems based on their structure and the way that they're written. So form itself is basically just the structure of the poem and the style of writing that the poem has. So there's three kinds of poems, and there's multiple different kinds of structures that they can follow, and all of these things come together to create a poem's form. So form might be based on the rhyme scheme that a poem uses, the number of lines that it has, the number of syllables that it follows, or the rhythm pattern that it follows. Maybe it's based on whether or not it rhymes or has a certain beat or a rhythm like that. Maybe it's based on if it's told from your internal perspective, if it's a story that's being told, if it's a description. All of these different things help define the form of the poem based on so many different factors. So we're just going to talk about some of the main basic ways to identify form and how they're most identifiable. Kind of what those three main kinds of poems look like, and how within those kind of poems you see the different elements of form. So I'm just going to work through the slideshow that is attached in Google Classroom. So if you guys are following along, the first slide is what is form. I just defined it for you. It's just the structure that the poem follows based on rhyme scheme, rhythm patterns, what the purpose is of the poem, what it's describing, how it's being told, all that kind of stuff. So that's form in a nutshell. And when you are looking for form in a structure, there is a very specific kind of pattern of things you need to look for. Is there a structure in place? How strictly is the poet following that structure? Where and why is the poet maybe going away from that structure? Where are repetitions occurring? Maybe they use the same line multiple times, or they use the same word again and again in the poem, like we saw in The Raven by Poe. They use the word nevermore a ton in there. And then how does the form signal a shift? That maybe helps us better understand the meaning of the poem. So where do they break away from rhyme scheme? Where do they kind of transition their attitude? All that different kind of stuff. So those are just some things you need to keep in mind while you are working through form to help you understand why the form exists the way it does for that specific poem, and how understanding form can help you better understand the poem. So that's basically what we're getting at today. So there are three main kinds of forms, or three main kinds of poems. Every poem ever written is going to fall into these three categories: a lyric poem, a narrative poem, and a descriptive poem. And they are basically exactly what they sound like. So a lyric poem is one with the speaker, who maybe isn't necessarily the poet, is talking more introspectively, more reflectively. They're talking about their emotions and their feelings. So anything that's like a love poem, anything that's talking about maybe a mental battle, anything like that that's more internal, more reflective, more about what's going on internally with the poet or the speaker of the poem, that is a lyric poem. So that's poems that are more touchy-feely, poems that are more romantic, poems that maybe they're even about sadness or hard times, but they just are only focused on emotions. You don't know what's going on outside in the poem, you just know the emotions that the speaker's feeling. So those are more emotion-based poems. Then a narrative poem is just a poem that tells a story. So its structure is really going to look similar to a story when you read it. It's going to have kind of that plot arch that we've talked about, with an introduction and a resolution, a conclusion, a climax. All that kind of stuff is going to be included in there. And it's going to kind of follow a storyline, and we're going to understand an event that's happening from outside. So we're looking in, and the poet is telling us a story, basically, about certain events, things that are happening over the course of time. So The Raven would be a loose example of a narrative poem, because it does follow kind of a basic story. We get the introduction, we see the guy sitting and reading, and then we watch him slowly kind of spiral into madness. So it's a narrative poem in that we kind of get to see this man's mental state progress in the same way that a story is told. So lyric poem is about emotions, internalized feelings, all that kind of stuff. Narrative poem is about telling a story, narrating something that's going on, giving the reader an understanding of events that are happening. And then a descriptive poem is just a poem that describes something. So that's going to be stuff like your nature poems, or a poem that's like describing someone's beauty. Anything that is emphasized on description, where you don't necessarily get a ton of emotion and you're also not getting a story, that's following into a descriptive poem. So it can be emotional, but it's usually more outward focused, and the poet or the speaker is describing something outside themselves. So that's the difference between lyric and descriptive, is lyric poetry is more internalized and they're describing their own feelings and their own emotions, whereas a descriptive poem, even if it is a romantic poem, is describing something happening outside of the poet. So those are the three main forms that poets use. All poems will fall under one of those three categories: lyric, narrative, or descriptive. So that's basically what that is. And then there are a few other aspects of form that I want to talk about today before I leave. So the first one is a stanza, and that's something you should all be familiar with already, but just a reminder, a stanza is a group of lines that are intentionally grouped together in a poem. So most commonly we see it in the form of a quatrain, which means we have 4 lines in a stanza, but sometimes we see it with a couplet, which is 2 lines in a stanza. So similar to paragraphs, stanzas are just kind of the different separated parts of a poem that are broken down by chunks of lines. So if you're looking at this poem, which is Robert Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening, it's broken up into stanzas like this. So these are broken into quatrains because there are 4 specific lines within each stanza, and then there's 4 stanzas in the poem. So hopefully that kind of helps you understand a stanza and a quatrain and a couplet. A couplet is just 2 lines. There's an example of that in the sonnet that you're working through in your assignment. And then a refrain is just when a line gets repeated multiple times throughout the work. So not just a word. A refrain wouldn't be like in Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven, Nevermore. That's not necessarily a refrain because that's just one word. A refrain is one line that's repeated multiple times. So in this one, he says, miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep, twice. So it's repeated, so that makes it a refrain. So it ends with a refrain, if that makes sense. So I know I was a little bit rambly today. I'm a little bit distracted because we got a new puppy this weekend, so I just wanted to try and power through this introduction for you guys as best that I could. If anything didn't make sense, please let me know. I'm happy to answer questions over email, and I am going to do a Zoom Q&A session this Thursday from 2 to 3. So I'm happy to answer any questions then over anything that didn't make sense. As usual, use this video, use the slides I provided in Classroom to fill out the note sheet. You can look stuff up if you need to, if you want to watch YouTube videos about stuff that maybe explains it better than I do. That's also fine. I am by no means an expert on poetry, but I do know it pretty well, so I'm excited to go through this part with you. This is when poetry starts to get more exciting. And next week, once we've finally finished talking about style and sound and form, you guys are going to be ready to start writing your own poems, and so I'm really excited to read those as well. Before I go, I will let you guys meet my puppy real quick, and then, yeah, that'll be it for today. Let me go grab him. Okay, this is Bo. Say hi, Bo. He just woke up from a nap. He was sleeping. So, yeah, that is it. And I hope you guys have a great week. We do not have school Friday. I don't know if you remember that or not. That was a previously, big yawn. That was a previously designated holiday day off. So I don't really know why we have the day off. It's not a specific holiday or anything, but we do not have school Friday. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.